One of the questions that came up had to do with authorship, and I got the sense that perhaps having doubts about whether or not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John might be troublesome. Is it troublesome? Because if it is, I can give you some more information, food for thought, about why it isn't so troublesome. I'll take that as a need to go into why it's not. All right. So, it may very well be that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Could be. But even if we could prove that they weren't, I submit to you that it doesn't matter. That what matters is the content of what has been written. So when we in the authorship of biblical texts, that does not necessarily amount to an attack on what is contained in the text, although sometimes it can amount to an attack. Especially if you want to argue that the authors were not eyewitnesses to the events of Jesus, that they were borrowing from somewhere else. Even if that's the case, that really doesn't change the trustworthiness of the content. And my plan is to help you see why that's the case as we go. But let's back up a little bit and let me talk about this particular kind of problem from the Old Testament point of view. It's a little bit easier to do it from there, and actually describing it in terms of difficulties we have with authorship of various documents in the Old Testament actually helps set us up for understanding why questions of authorship actually work in favor of the Gospel's authenticity. So, for example, the Old Testament has been attributed to, especially the Torah, first 5 books of the Bible, to Moses. The Psalms to David. You've got the Song of Solomon or Ecclesiastes. Maybe Solomon wrote those. But whether they did or they didn't, I don't think affects the content. Unless you're wed to a view that what they contain is actual history. So if you're wed to Genesis 1 through 3 is not a theological story, but it is a historical story, well, then it may very well matter that Moses wrote them. But once you become familiar with the world of that ancient world, not only the ancient world of Israel, but the ancient world surrounding Israel, then serious questions arise about insisting, for example, that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. For example, there is a document, a pagan document, about the creation called the Enuma Elish. It's Babylonian. The story itself is dated, and they date it based on a combination of linguistic and historical factors to around 1,700 years before Christ. If we accept that Moses wrote Genesis, at best the conclusion about when he would have written it would have been during the wilderness wanderings between 1446 and 1406, which makes the Enuma Elish about 300 years older than the story of creation told in Genesis 1 through 3. Now, very few people try to insist on a direct line of dependence between the Enuma Elish and Genesis 1 through 3, but there are similarities. For example, the sequence of days is similar, including the creation of the firmament, the dry land, the luminaries, and humanity, followed by rest. Darkness precedes creative acts. There is a division of the waters. Light exists before the creation of the sun, the moon, and the stars. The chief difference is that the Babylonian story depicts creation as a cosmic battle between the god Marduk and his great-great-grandmother, the goddess Tiamat. But however different they are, they unquestionably have a common way of speaking about the beginning of the world. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. It's E-N-N-S. Peter Enns. That would be how I would pronounce it. Peter Enns is a PhD biblical scholar who actually comes from a very fundamentalist background. And he has gotten to a point where he realizes that trying to maintain sort of doctrinal integrity within the thought world that he was raised in Christianity is simply impossible given what he has learned about things like the Enuma Elish and other aspects of antiquity. So one of the things that he says about this comparison between the Enuma Elish and Genesis 1 through 3 is that it isn't so much that we need to draw a direct line of dependence, but that we need to understand that Genesis 1 through 3 comes from the same thought world. That there was in other words, it was written not to us, nor for us. It was written in an ancient world, in an ancient time, to ancient people. And it would be reasonable to suggest that the Genesis story is meant to be contrasted with the reigning Babylonian ideology. So there's one example. Moses may have written it. Moses may or may not have known anything about the Enuma Elish. But what is for darn sure is that he's from the same thought world, writing in a world that thought about things that way. Secondly, with regard to the flood, there's an ancient document called the Epic of Gilgamesh. The earliest copies are Sumerian, and they're dated between 2000 and 1500 BC. When Gilgamesh is read side by side with Genesis 6 through 8, the story of Noah and the flood, there's a clear connection between the two. Now, facts like this raise serious questions about authorship. And they raise questions about the meaning and purpose of these stories. And first and foremost, what the Enuma Elish and Gilgamesh tell us, as I've just said, is that these stories we have were not written to us or for us. They come from an ancient world, a world in which these stories make the sense that they do, or made sense back then, spoke powerfully to those who read them. And so when we read these stories, we cannot read them as if they're supposed to conform or make sense to a 21st century understanding of the world, or that they were written as history following the rules we would come to expect from historians. Does this mean that these stories are not God's Word? No, it does not mean that. It means that we need to adjust our thinking to what, in fact, the Bible teaches us about what God's Word is. When, however, we look at the ancient world of the first century, we have a different problem. The Bible, when we look outside the Bible for stories of the resurrection, we're confronted with something brand new. There isn't any similarity between the resurrection stories and other stories of resurrection in, say, Greek mythology. And there's certainly no connection to an understanding of resurrection in Judaism. And that raises the same kind of questions of, well, where did they come from? Now, one of the things that I'm walking us through is that there's been a presumption in 19th and 20th century biblical scholarship that no one can rise from the dead. Therefore, these stories of the resurrection cannot be history or in any way trying to relay historical information or things about an actual event. So there must be something else going on. That's the assumption. Of course, when you start with that kind of assumption, it's kind of easy to come up with all kinds of explanations and reasons for why the Gospels are written the way they are. But when we try to frame the resurrection stories historically, what we end up with is what I submit is powerful evidence that these stories of resurrection take us back to the earliest oral tradition. Now remember what I said last week. The closer in time a story is to the events that it purports to tell, the general assumption is the more reliable the documents that we have about that story. Now, it doesn't prove that the story is true. My point is that we have evidence that suggests the stories of the resurrection in the Gospels are accurate representations of those stories as they were told in the years following Jesus' resurrection. And those would certainly have been oral stories. And just in case this isn't obvious, in that world where you didn't just pick up a pen and paper, okay, the only way you really had anything to write with is maybe people could write on a pot shard, broken pot. Most people didn't have access to papyrus. So what do? You tell stories. Well, when you're in a culture that tells stories, you can be pretty darn sure that that story gets told pretty much the same way, over and over and over again. Now, that doesn't mean that different versions of the story don't crop up. They certainly do. But even as they crop up, those stories tend to stay true to where they started from. Okay, so what I'm getting at is that when we look at the Old Testament, we have questions that come from the ancient world that suggest that the stories of the flood, for example, of Noah and the ark, for example, are stories that predate Genesis. And it seems to suggest that either the author of Genesis had access to this story or these stories, or as Peter Ian says, this is just how people thought. But when we get to the first century and we look outside the Bible for stories of resurrection, and there are stories of resurrection, but they're nothing like the resurrection stories in the Gospels. And that raises interesting questions about where they possibly could come from. Okay? So, this may seem like a leap, and I'm sorry if it does, but I'm trying to summarize things and not go into burden you with too much detail about biblical criticism. But when I talk about authorship last week, I said that whether the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote it is up for grabs. Whether they were edited is very likely that they were edited. I pointed to Mark 16 verses 9 to 20 as the best example of where there's almost unanimous agreement that doesn't belong in Mark. The dates that when they were written are contested. The good news is that attestation, that is to say that we have thousands upon thousands upon thousands of copies of the New Testament in the Gospels. And when we put them all side by side, they are remarkably consistent. And that's certainly in its favor. However, when you add all this up with the presumption that no one rises from the dead, then what we end up with is a consensus of 20th century biblical scholarship that goes something like this. This is from N.T. Wright. Though there is wide disagreement about many details, the consensus that has emerged is that whatever may have happened a few days after Jesus' death, the gospel accounts do not take us very far towards a description of Easter Day, but instead put us in touch with the theology, the politics, and the issues of the early Christian church. In other words, the Easter stories do not relay historical information. Perhaps, like the creation story in Genesis 1 through 3, they are stories that are laden with theological significance, but little historical significance. The hypothesis goes that each evangelist, remember the word evangelist is just a word referring to the authors of the Gospels, that each evangelist was writing to address the issues pertinent to their Christian community wherever it was located. So they took from the sources available to them snippets of the stories of Jesus and put them together, but with no thought or intention that these stories are connected to actual historical events. And to which N.T. Wright says, "Oh yeah?" So, in other words, the scholarship has concluded that the authors are concerned to address issues in his own day, his own issues, his own Christian community's issues, whatever they might have been and wherever that Christian community may have been located. Are you with me? Okay. N.T. Wright observes that scholars who have attempted to reconstruct the world, the agenda, and the aims of the four evangelists note that each writer was careful to describe Jesus as he was in his own day, rather than as a member of their own community. And that raises a question. So let me try to diagram this out. So we've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, writing somewhere 30 plus years after Jesus' death. Okay? And over here, we have Jesus Christ and, the issues that were around in the early 30s AD, 30 to 33 AD. The scholars who say that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are writing these stories to address issues here have nevertheless taken pains to make sure that Jesus appears to belong here. Which raises the question of, if you are trying to write a story about the issues of your own day, and you're doing so by inventing a historical story that really is sort of an allegory to events in your own day, why would you then make the main character talk and act like he belongs here rather than here? In other words, the issues that we can identify issues in this period of time for the early Christian church, and I'm going to do that in a moment. They don't appear here. The issues that are here don't show up here. So how do you maintain as credible a theory about the origins of these documents that depend on their origin having to do with issues from this period of time? This is what's motivating Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to write the Gospels, and yet none of those issues appear in the Gospels themselves. Why would you do that? Now, Wright goes on to argue at this point, if we start by supposing that the stories of Easter in some way or another come from sources that are based on actual recollections of real events, well, then it's easy to see how they could later come to be used to address the lives of Christians in a different time and place. No problem. Do you understand what I'm saying here? So if we start with the premise that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are relying, remember I talked about Q? Okay? Let's say that Q could be oral or written, and let's assume that it may not just be one thing, and just not necessarily one or the other. It's simply a way of summarizing the fact that there are sources out there, and this theory is supported by the similarities between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's why we call them the Synoptic Gospels. And the question is, gee, is that similarity because each of those writers, writing independently, had access to the same source material? So what if we assume that this material, whatever it is, actually is connected to that? Okay? That it's purporting to tell a story of real events. Well, it's not really too hard to understand how Christians in a later time might take this material and then use it to address issues in their own day. But if we suppose, as 20th century scholarship has supposed, that the sources invented or reconstructed these stories of Jesus, in other words, if this source material has invented stories here, but it's actually arising out of other issues. So Hugh is motivated by, for example, and I'll get to this in a moment. One of the issues that affected Christians quite early on was the issue of personal hope. That there is a connection between the resurrection of Jesus and our resurrection. Paul makes that connection over and over and over and over and over again. There is no connection like that in the Gospels. It's not there. It's as if the Gospels are trying to say something else entirely. That doesn't mean that there isn't a connection. It just means that if personal hope is an issue here, or an issue here, well, we have to wonder, how would these stories have ended up the way they did? Because, as I started, the stories themselves are faithful to this period of time. They're faithful to this period of time. Why would a church that is concerned about future hope and the resurrection of Christians in the face of persecution, why wouldn't these people write the story in such a way that would convey that hope? They don't. Why? I mean, if the theory is correct, that these authors are being motivated and inventing stories from somewhere else, well, the stories we have are very, very strange. And in fact, N.T. Wright argues that it's ultimately preposterous to assert that these stories were written to address some other issues and have the stories turn out the way they did. They wouldn't have been written that way. And I'm going to go into 4 reasons why this is true, and hopefully this is going to become clearer and clearer as we go. There are 4 reasons why the whole idea that these stories are written to address issues in the 30s, or excuse me, the 60s and 65 AD, why that just couldn't be if the stories are what they are. For example, there's the strange silence of the Bible references in the Easter stories. Now this is remarkable because up to now, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, up until the resurrection stories, there is a persistent buildup of scriptural quotations, allusion, references, and echo. A glance at the biblical references in the margins. Go to your Bible and look at the margins of Mark 11 through 15. I pulled out my NIV study Bible, and there are constant citations referencing passages from the Old Testament. But at chapter 16, zip. None. Even the burial story in Matthew and Luke has resonances to the Old Testament. Now, let me remind you of the significance of that. Remember that Mark ends with an empty tomb. Jesus is buried, the tomb is empty, but there are no stories of resurrection. There are no appearances of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. Matthew and Luke, when they tell the burial story, they have allusions to Old Testament references, but when we get to the resurrection appearances, they disappear. It's as if, N.T. Wright says, it's as if they convey the naked feeling of a solo flute piping a new melody after the orchestra has fallen silent. Given that the evangelists have freely referenced the Old Testament, why did they stop here? Especially if they're trying to point out or point to allegory as a way of teaching something. If you're trying to teach a bunch of people in 60 and 65 AD something, and you want to prove it with biblical references, why wouldn't they appear in your story? This is remarkable, secondly, because we know from Paul and the rest of the New Testament that the resurrection of Jesus Christ was seen as having occurred precisely according to the Scriptures. Not only was it seen that way, it was vitally important to the early church that it be seen by others as fulfilling the Scriptures. So how easy would it have been for the authors of the Easter stories if those stories are developed based on assumptions 30 years after Jesus? How easy would it have been to have one of the angels at the tomb, or one of the disciples, or even a woman, or even Jesus himself, give voice to a biblical passage which would do for the Easter story what reciting those biblical passages did for the rest of the gospel, all that came before it, because they're everywhere. In Matthew, at the point of Easter, not once do we hear his up to then constant refrain, all this took place so that it might be fulfilled what was spoken by the prophets. All of a sudden, it's like static. Nothing's happening at the resurrection stories. John tells us that the two who ran to the tomb, quote, did not yet know the scripture that he must rise again from the dead. But then, not only does he not tell us which scriptures he has in mind, he doesn't even hint at them at the rest of his story. Okay? So that's a problem. If we are going to assume that these stories are made up in order to address issues 30 years after Jesus' death, why, when the rest of the Gospels are filled with biblical imagery from the Old Testament, suddenly they fall silent at the resurrection? Secondly, what I've already pointed out is the strange absence of personal hope. So in terms of any attempt by historians to assess what the Easter stories think they are about, it's extremely strange that at no point do they mention the future hope of the Christian. And that's counterintuitive, to say the least. 1,000 hymns and countless sermons have concentrated on life after death as the central problem to which Jesus is the solution. But neither going to heaven, or life after death, eternal life, or even the resurrection of all Christ's people is so much as mentioned in the Easter stories. If Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wanted to tell stories whose significance was, Jesus is risen, therefore you will be too, they did a pretty bad job of it. Instead, what we find is an open-ended commission within the present world that Jesus is risen, therefore you have work to do. The stories don't include any mention of a future resurrection or being with Jesus in a post-mortem existence. And that sets these stories in stark contrast to the entire rest of the New Testament. Paul speaks of Christ's resurrection. He links it constantly with the resurrection of Christ's people. The first letter of Peter does the same. If all we had to go on were the Easter stories themselves, we would know nothing of them as providing a basis for future hope beyond the grave. What the Easter stories are about in that first century world where he's so very Jewish, the Easter stories seem, not even strong enough. It's like they are about the vindication of Jesus. From a Jewish point of view, it seems that the significance of the resurrection was not that everyone gets to go to heaven, but that Jesus was the Messiah after all, even though he had been killed. It was a validation of his messiahship, and it was a validation of the commissioning of his followers to announce to the world that Jesus was the world's surprising but rightful Lord. It's mystifying in the extreme that the resurrection stories, if the resurrection stories are about, for example, the deep inner experience of Jesus' followers. Now let me back up and say that one way of explaining away the resurrection is that the followers of Jesus were deeply moved at a deeply profound emotional level. And so there was this sense of conviction in the heart that even though Jesus was dead, he somehow was alive. Okay? If that's what's going on, the stories don't do anything to convey that message. Nothing. There's no warming of the heart. We've got a bodily person walking around. Why? The third thing, there's the strange portrait of Jesus himself in the stories. I've already hinted, maybe I'm being redundant here, but I'll do it anyway because I know how difficult this is to absorb. So we've got late 19th and 20th century scholarship being driven on the assumption that these stories developed and came about as a result of Christians 30 plus years later pondering the scriptures and trying to express and re-express their faith and address the issues of their own day. But if that was the case, we would expect these stories to reflect the kind of things that beloved resurrection passages in the Old Testament had been saying. I mean, you're 30 years later, if you're going to make up a story about the resurrection, where would you go to find your data for that resurrection? Well, wouldn't you go to the Old Testament? And there are beloved resurrection passages in the Old Testament. So it's not as if it would have been a really difficult thing. Resurrection wasn't unknown in Judaism. It's just that the thought was that there was a general resurrection of all God's people at the end of time, not the resurrection of one human being in the middle of time. But the thing is that none of those biblical passages appear. Jesus is never depicted in the Easter stories, for example, as being radiant and shining and brilliant like the Transfiguration. That kind of image is strangely absent, significantly absent. The sightings of and meetings with Jesus are not like descriptions of heavenly visions or visions of figures in blinding light or dazzling radiance or wreathed in the clouds, such that we might expect from Jewish apocalyptic tradition. Whatever account we give of the vision of Jesus in Revelation chapter 1, there's nothing in the Easter narratives that correspond to it. Revelation, written by John, is out in a world by itself. So they're not, in other words, the sort of thing that one would expect if the gospel writers or their sources had wanted to say that Jesus had been exalted to a position of either divine or heavenly glory. Nor are they the kind of thing that would have been said if early Christianity had begun by wanting to say that Yahweh had approved of Jesus' messianic ministry, that his death was a success, not a failure, if that were the case, we would expect images of exaltation like we find in the book of Daniel. Where Jesus appears in the Easter story, he appears as a human being among human beings. So let's test this. Let's test what I'm trying to say, and hopefully it'll become even clearer as we go. So suppose the early Christians, or a Christian writer of the 40s or 50s or 60s, had been studying the Scriptures and now wanted to tell the story of Jesus' death and of God's approval of him in terms of a fictitious resurrection, and he wanted to do so in a way that would reflect the Old Testament biblical text. What Scriptures would they go to? Well, towering above them all would be Daniel 12, 2-3. Daniel 12. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Do you hear the resurrection echoes here? And did you note that multitudes who are asleep will awake? Right? Belief in general resurrection. And these people will shine like the sun or like the stars. But in the Gospels, Jesus is routinely depicted as having a human body with properties that are, to be sure, unusual. Luke describes a Jesus who ate broiled fish, invites others to touch him, and who appears and disappears at will. And at one appearance, two close friends don't recognize him. Excuse me. In the Gospel of John, John tells us of a Jesus who invites Thomas to touch him and who enters through locked doors and is only partially recognized. Matthew has Jesus meeting and commissioning his followers to go and make disciples, and that some among of Jesus' followers doubted. What are these stories trying to tell us? Are you with me? Yeah, I'm going to stop for questions.
Are you saying that the references to the resurrection in the Old Testament are general, but there are none that are specific to the coming Messiah?
Only in hindsight, only when we impose on the text, meaning that wasn't there in the first century. I can't say off the top of my head what some of those might be, but when we look at not just the biblical text, but the text of the Apocrypha, for example, a lot of those texts were read by first century Jews and were part of their worldview. And there just isn't anything of one person rising from the dead in the middle of history. It's just again and again and again, a general resurrection. And not everyone believed in the resurrection anyway. It's not as if all Jews believed in it. Some did. Maybe even many did. The Sadducees famously did not believe in the resurrection. Other questions? Have I lost you? Just say if I've lost you. You can admit it. I'll try to... What I'm trying to do is point out that if we assume, as 20th century scholarship has assumed, that the writers of the Gospels were writing to address issues in their own day, well then, these things that I'm talking about are really strange. Why are there no references to the Old Testament in these stories when they're everywhere up until the resurrection? They're everywhere. I mean, we might argue that everything that came before the resurrection stories were written by authors who are trying to address issues in their own day. And so in order to make that more plausible, they sprinkled Old Testament passages throughout sort of to give credence to the stories of Jesus. But then when we get to the resurrection, poof, they're all gone. That's strange. Yeah.
Well, God did a new thing with the resurrection. Would they not look to the Old Testament? Because why would it be in the Old Testament? It's a new thing.
And therein is the question. Because what we're exposing here is the underlying assumption there can be no resurrection. Therefore, there has to be some other explanation for these stories. And we're ignoring what N.T. Wright is saying is the historically more plausible explanation. That the reason they don't contain references to the scriptures is because it was so outlandish, it was so earth-shattering, that they were confused beyond all get out and had no idea what to make of it. That they were just blown away by the fact that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And the stories that we have portray that kind of confusion. It's like, well, we know this doesn't make any sense, because it's not as if people in the first century didn't know, like we do today, that people don't rise from the dead. They most certainly did know that. No one rises from the dead. Boom! There is Jesus. Could it be that that's the explanation for why the resurrection stories are written the way they're written? And that from an historian point of view, it makes far more sense to at least argue that the first Christians believed in the fiber of their being. This doesn't prove that Jesus rose from the dead, but it does suggest that the first Christians believed in the fiber of their being that he did. That they weren't just making up a story. This wasn't like the mythologies of resurrection stories of resurrection in Greek mythology, because even the Greeks knew that they were stories, that they were mythological. There was no Greek or Roman who believed that anyone would ever rise from the dead, even though they had stories of resurrection. Doesn't happen. Boom. Someone does rise from the dead. And the last thing I was going to say, and I'll come to it, unless we have a question, real quickly, the strange presence of the women. Go ahead. Well, you write it down.
How does Dorcas fit into all this? Or Lazarus?
Dorcas is in Acts.
Right. But it's a resurrection story or not?
Yes, but we're not dealing with that. That's later. That's later. We're not talking about Jesus. We're not talking about that's a resuscitation. I'm sorry. That's not a resurrection. It's a resuscitation. It's like Lazarus being raised from the dead. And that's another aspect of the gospel stories. Jesus' body was real, but it was different. It was resurrected, but it was transformed. It stands apart from the resurrection, the raising of Lazarus from the dead, or Dorcas, because those are resuscitations. Then there's the strange presence of the women in the stories.
I was thinking Q could possibly be a woman because it's all.
Well, I mean, again,
they wouldn't accept women writers.
here's the thing. So remember that we've got Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 gives his own sort of version of the resurrection story. It's not really a story, it's more of a Jesus appeared to these people. And you know who's conspicuously absent? The women. Why? Well, because if you're trying to convey to Greek people or to people who are pagan, or tell them a story about something preposterous like a resurrection, the last thing you're going to do is have women in the story. And I think that Paul took them out. But there they are in the Gospels. There they are. And remember, Paul predates the Gospels. Okay, he was writing first.
So he might not have known the women went to the...
Oh, I'm sure he would have known the stories. Okay. It's very clear that he knew the oral tradition. unclear that he was aware of a written gospel, but the oral traditions were floating around, without a doubt. So even if we assume that Mark, being the earliest gospel, it's simply incredible, beyond credible, that anyone making up a story about an empty tomb would have women be the ones who find it. Because women were not acceptable as legal witnesses. I know that may get lost on us, but let me repeat that. They're completely not credible. They're just not credible, period. They can't even appear in court. Well, I'm just trying to make the point. Then why are they there? Why? Unless the writers are saying, well, this is the way it happened. This is the way it happened. We're telling it like it is. Debates in the 3rd century among theologians like Origen and Celsus shows us that critics of Christianity would hang on the women and point to them as reasons to scoff at the whole thing. Were the gospel writers really so ignorant of the likely reaction of the presence of women? Were they so ignorant of that that they did not make the first witnesses men? It tells us that everyone within the earliest Christianity, what it tells us is that everyone in earliest Christianity knew they were women. Do you understand the significance of that? You're telling a story about the resurrection, and you're telling it to people who are also Christian. And every last one of them knows that women were there. So you're not going to tell a story where the women are removed when you know they're going to come at you and go, wait a minute, what about the women? Now, Paul isn't writing to Jews. Paul is arguing with pagans. He doesn't have the same problem. So he can take the women out to try to make his point. Because he doesn't have to worry about blowback. That's not the case with the gospel writers. So those 4 things raise big question marks about 100 years of biblical scholarship that has been suggesting that these stories don't tell us anything about what really happened, when in fact they very likely do.
When did the mental shift come for the disciples following the resurrection, when they believed that Jesus rose from the dead, but when did they start believing that they too will rise?
Well, the earliest references we have to that kind of thing is Paul and Luke in Acts. We begin to connect the dots, especially as he talks about Paul's ministry. But Paul, I think, is credited with really connecting the dots. I mean, his background as a Jewish scholar. I mean, he was as he describes himself, a Pharisee among Pharisees. And he is the one who, thinking as a Jew, is putting all of that. What could this possibly mean? What would this possibly mean? What is the implications of Jesus' resurrection? For us, for the world, for the cosmos, and Paul is where we get it. So, within 30 years or so, and if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written in the same period of time, why do those Easter stories not betray a need or desire to talk about our hope as followers of Jesus? If the motive for writing them was to address the issues here rather than here. Yes?
The disciples were hiding. They were terrified.
Yeah, initially, yes, they were.
At the death when Jesus was on the cross, the women were there, but the disciples, only John was there.
That's right. That's right. And if that's not the way it happened, it's just very, very strange that the Gospels put them there. When you're, if you're trying to be persuasive in that world, you wouldn't get your point across, at least not very easily, with women as the first witnesses. And that's just one. I've pointed out 4 things about these resurrection stories that are remarkable if the assumption is that these are made-up stories. It's just remarkable. So let me, before we leave, I'm going to summarize them. What time is it? I have maybe 30 seconds. Okay, so the point number 1. Silence of the Old Testament. Where are the biblical passages from the Old Testament about resurrection? Oh, he's not there. Absence of personal hope. There's nothing in there about Jesus rose from the dead and we will too, even though it's in Paul. Then there's the portrait of Jesus himself. The portrait of Jesus in terms of the resurrection, he's not shining. Okay? He's not bright and glimmering like a star like we find in Daniel. He's being depicted, he is depicted as a human, though transformed. And what was the 4th one? The women. So it isn't just any one of these things, it's all 4 of these things that make you, it just draws into question, it brings all of this scholarship of 100 years into question. Okay.
Does John at the cross during the crucifixion change the fact that otherwise it was just women to witness the death of Jesus?
Does John...
How John was there and Jesus said, Mary, this is your son, he will take care of you. As we go along, I'm going to talk about John. We have to come at John a little bit differently. Okay. I think we do, ultimately, the conclusion, I think, is John is drawing from a strand of tradition that is different than the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But that doesn't make it less authentic. Okay. That there were different ways that the stories were told. And that shouldn't surprise us, especially given the surprising nature of them. It's like, there's an auto accident and you got 4 witnesses, and each one of them tells the story differently, sometimes remarkably differently. But an accident still happened. Mm-hmm. Okay, so something like that's going on. I got to stop.